Dear learners, welcome back to WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today's journey takes us into the life of a man whose name became synonymous with both extraordinary wealth and ruthless ambition. A man born into poverty, who rose to become one of the richest individuals in history. A man who shaped modern capitalism, created a global oil empire, and yet spent his final decades giving away most of his fortune. This is the story of John D. Rockefeller. But this is not just a tale of money or business. It is a profound story about resilience, vision, and transformation. About how a young boy, raised by a con artist father and a devout mother, would grow up with a burning desire for control over his life, his fate, and eventually, over an entire industry. You will not only improve your English in this episode, but more than that, it will challenge your beliefs, awaken your ambition, and leave you reflecting on what true success really means. So, how did a quiet, disciplined boy with a shaky start become the architect of one of the most powerful monopolies in American history? Get ready for a story of immense ambition, fierce competition, and unexpected redemption. Let's start the journey, from shadows of uncertainty to the heights of an oil empire. The year was 1839. America was a young, restless nation, full of promise but still finding its footing. The Industrial Revolution was beginning to ripple across the Atlantic, and whispers of great fortunes were stirring in the smoky shadows of coal mines and railroad tracks. It was a time of expansion and of exploitation. Opportunity lived alongside inequality. And into this complicated world, John Davison Rockefeller was born. He came into the world on July 8th, in a modest farmhouse in Richford, New York. His family had little in the way of comfort. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, known to most simply as Big Bill, was a peddler, traveling from town to town selling herbal remedies and elixirs, many of them worthless. He styled himself a botanic physician, but in truth, he was a confidence man, a smooth-talking, unreliable drifter who often left the family to fend for themselves. His mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was the exact opposite. Deeply religious, morally upright, and determined to raise her children with discipline and faith. She managed the household, stretched every penny, and taught young John the virtues of thrift, hard work, and self-control. In many ways, she was the anchor of the family, quiet, firm, and deeply influential. The Rockefellers moved often, chasing opportunity and escaping debt. Eventually, they settled in Cleveland, Ohio, where the seeds of John's future would quietly begin to take root. But childhood was not easy. He learned early on that money brought security, and that the lack of it brought fear. Watching his father disappear for weeks or months at a time, leaving behind uncertainty and unpaid bills, John developed an obsession with order and predictability. He didn't want a life ruled by luck or charm. He wanted control. The economic backdrop of the time was unforgiving. The country suffered frequent financial panics, and families like the Rockefellers were constantly at risk. Young John saw neighbors lose everything overnight. He saw boys his age taken out of school to help their families survive. And he watched how the world respected wealth, even when it was gained through questionable means. This contrast between his mother's moral teachings and his father's cunning would create a lifelong internal tension in John. Could a man be both good and powerful? Could he rise to greatness without losing his soul? It's here, in these early, uncertain years, that the foundations of a titan were quietly forming, not in wealth or knowledge, but in discipline, observation, and an unshakable will. But John wouldn't wait long to put these lessons into practice. A storm was coming, a trial that would push the young boy into the adult world far sooner than anyone expected. By the time John was a teenager, the world around him had grown harsher. His father's absences became more frequent, and the family's financial instability began to weigh heavily on him. While other boys played or dreamed, John watched his mother juggle unpaid debts and household needs with stoic calm. Every dollar mattered. Every decision counted. At just 16, John D. Rockefeller made a choice that would shape the rest of his life. He left school and began looking for work. But finding a job wasn't easy. This was the late 1850s, and Cleveland's economy was unpredictable. Railroads were expanding, but the nation's financial health was fragile. He pounded the pavement for weeks, knocking on doors, inquiring at offices, and facing rejection after rejection. Day after day, he dressed in his one decent suit, carrying handwritten references and a quiet determination. Some turned him away without a second glance. Others mocked his youth. But he kept going. And after 6 long weeks, on September 26, 1855, a small produce shipping firm called Hewitt and Tuttle finally gave him a chance, as a bookkeeper. He was paid 50 cents a day. To most, it was a humble clerical job. But to John, it was the start of something greater. He showed up early, stayed late, and treated every cent he handled as if it were his own. He watched the way goods moved, how markets reacted, and how profits were made or lost. He wasn't just doing numbers. He was absorbing the logic of business. His coworkers noticed his discipline. His bosses noticed his reliability. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, and never acted impulsively. In fact, he once said, "I do not think that there is any quality so essential to success of any kind as the quality of perseverance." And persevere he did. Still, the pressure at home never lifted. His father continued to disappear, occasionally showing up with new stories and even new families. Yes, Big Bill led a double life, marrying another woman while still legally married to John's mother. The shame and instability this brought were not lost on young John. But rather than rebel or collapse, he retreated inward. He focused on work. On saving. On building something solid and unshakable. By 18, he had saved enough to go into business himself, teaming up with a partner to start their own produce firm, Clark and Rockefeller. They weren't selling oil yet. They were selling grain, hay, and meats, basic goods for a country on the move. But more importantly, John was learning to negotiate, to calculate risks, to read the winds of the economy. And when the Civil War broke out in 1861, many businesses crumbled, but John adapted. The war economy increased demand for supplies, and his small firm survived. Yet he wanted more. And it was during this time that he heard whispers of a new industry just beginning to stir. Black gold. Oil. Still, many dismissed oil as a dangerous gamble. It gushed and leaked. It caught fire. Most considered it a passing trend. But John saw something else, a future. And once he entered the oil business, nothing, not competition, not critics, not even the government, would ever see him the same way again. The year was 1863, and John D. Rockefeller was just 24 years old when he made his first serious move into the oil business. Alongside his new partner, Samuel Andrews, a skilled chemist, Rockefeller invested in a small oil refinery in Cleveland. It was a modest operation, unremarkable compared to others springing up during the Pennsylvania oil boom. But John wasn't interested in quick profits. he was watching something deeper. At the time, the oil industry was chaotic. Wells were drilled recklessly. Transportation was expensive and unreliable. Refineries sprang up overnight and disappeared just as fast, either exploding, going bankrupt, or both. Oil was black, smelly, unstable, and risky. But where others saw mess, Rockefeller saw opportunity. He believed the oil industry could be disciplined, refined, and made efficient. He focused on kerosene, the clean-burning oil used for lamps, and began building an operation that valued consistency, safety, and quality above all. His method was simple: reduce waste, increase efficiency, and reinvest every possible dollar into growth. He counted barrels. He tracked rail prices. He negotiated shipping rates like a seasoned general plotting a campaign. Every detail mattered. He also reinvested almost every cent of profit. While others spent their earnings, John expanded operations, bought more equipment, and reinvested in infrastructure. Slowly, his refinery grew. And soon, he founded what would become his most famous venture, Standard Oil. But competition was fierce. The oil business was like the Wild West, filled with speculation, fraud, and dangerous games. Competitors often undercut each other with unstable prices or shady deals. Rockefeller, however, was calm and methodical. He didn't fight with fire. He smothered it with strategy. He struck secret deals with railroads for shipping discounts. He bought out competitors, quietly, one by one. Some accused him of strong-arming, others of brilliance. But the result was the same. Within a few years, Standard Oil was no longer just a refinery. It was the refinery. The most efficient, the most reliable, and the most profitable. Still, the public didn't know much about Rockefeller. He rarely spoke to the press. He avoided flashy displays of wealth. He wasn't interested in fame, he was building an empire in silence. But behind that silence was tension. His aggressive tactics were beginning to raise eyebrows. Smaller competitors called him a monopolist. Journalists whispered about collusion. And workers in the industry feared the growing power of Standard Oil. John, however, believed he was doing the right thing. He saw his success not as greed, but as discipline. Others wasted resources, he maximized them. Others chased fortune, he created structure. He believed he was bringing order to chaos. And yet, behind this rising empire was still the heart of a man shaped by childhood instability, a boy who once feared hunger, now obsessed with control. At home, he was a devout Baptist, deeply religious, and committed to charity. He gave quietly, attended church regularly, and raised his children with strict values. But in business, he was relentless. Cold, calculating, and utterly focused. And so the duality deepened. Was he a saint or a robber baron? A visionary or a tyrant in a black coat? Let's pause for a moment. Do you think Rockefeller's tactics were justified? If you were a business owner back then, would you have played by the same rules or walked away? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because as Standard Oil rose to dominance, public scrutiny would rise with it. And soon, Rockefeller would face a turning point that would define not just his business, but the man himself. By the early 1870s, Rockefeller was no longer a small player. Standard Oil had expanded rapidly, consuming competitors and forming partnerships that gave it near-total control over Cleveland's refining industry. But John wanted more. He didn't just want to dominate Cleveland, he wanted to control the entire oil supply of the United States. To achieve this, he needed leverage, not only over competitors but over transportation itself. And so, in 1872, he initiated what would become the most controversial and defining move of his career, the South Improvement Company scheme. In secret meetings with major railroad companies, Rockefeller negotiated a series of deals that would give Standard Oil massive rebates on every barrel it shipped, while charging his competitors full price. Even more stunning, he would receive a portion of the fees paid by his competitors. It was a breathtakingly calculated power play, one that could effectively choke out any rival that dared to challenge him. Rockefeller believed it was business logic. He often said, "The day of combination is here to stay." He thought of it as streamlining an industry plagued by chaos. But when word of the South Improvement Company leaked to the press, the reaction was explosive. Independent refiners, stunned and enraged, banded together in protest. In Pennsylvania, oil producers revolted. Newspapers blasted the deal as immoral and un-American. Mobs formed. Angry businessmen marched through the streets of Titusville and Oil City, demanding justice. One editorial called it the most gigantic and daring scheme of monopoly and extortion that ever originated in the brain of man. The public outcry forced the railroads to back away. The South Improvement Company collapsed within months. But for Rockefeller, the damage was already done. Though his plan had failed, he had revealed his hand and his ambition. His name, once anonymous, became infamous. In the months that followed, he worked in silence. No angry speeches. No retaliation. Just calculation. He began buying out competitors more quietly, through intermediaries and complex arrangements. He offered two options: sell to Standard Oil at a fair price, or be crushed in the market. Most sold. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of U.S. refining capacity. Not just in Cleveland, but in New York, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and beyond. The empire was real. And John D. Rockefeller, still in his 30s, was now one of the most powerful men in America. But power came with a price. Critics called him a monopolist. Journalists labeled him the face of corporate greed. Political cartoonists depicted him as an octopus, strangling the nation. And even though he donated millions to churches and charities, the public image of Rockefeller began to darken. What hurt most was the contradiction. He had always believed he was improving the industry, making oil safer, cheaper, and more efficient. And in many ways, he was. Thanks to Standard Oil, kerosene became affordable for ordinary Americans. Oil prices stabilized. Explosions became rare. Lighting homes no longer meant risking death or wasting money. But at what cost? Small businesses vanished. Competition withered. And the idea of the self-made man, once a sacred part of American identity, now seemed endangered by Rockefeller's overwhelming control. And yet, despite the backlash, he pressed forward. Because for John, this wasn't about being liked. It was about building something that would last. Something no one could take away. Something unshakable. Was Rockefeller simply adapting to a cutthroat system, or was he bending the rules too far? Was this brilliant strategy or moral failure? That's a question still debated today. But whatever side you're on, one thing is certain: John D. Rockefeller had crossed a line. And there was no turning back. An even greater conflict was coming, one that would test not only his business but his soul. By the 1880s, John D. Rockefeller stood atop a kingdom unlike any the world had seen. Standard Oil wasn't just a company, it was a machine. It refined, transported, marketed, and sold oil across the United States and beyond. Through an intricate web of subsidiaries and hidden trusts, Rockefeller controlled nearly every step of the industry. But his greatest strength, control, was becoming his greatest liability. As Standard Oil's grip tightened, public suspicion turned into full-blown outrage. Journalists, politicians, and even former allies accused Rockefeller of manipulating markets, crushing rivals, and twisting laws to serve one purpose: absolute power. Then came the moment that would change everything. In 1902, an unlikely adversary emerged: Ida Tarbell, a reserved but fearless journalist whose father had once been driven out of the oil business by Standard Oil's ruthless practices. For years, she investigated in silence, collecting documents, interviewing former employees, and piecing together a narrative no one had dared to tell. In 1904, she published The History of the Standard Oil Company, a scathing 19-part exposé that laid bare the secret deals, the intimidation tactics, and the quiet takeovers that built Rockefeller's empire. Tarbell's work shocked the nation. For the first time, the public saw behind the curtain. Rockefeller was painted not as a genius businessman, but as a puppet master of corporate dominance. The book became a sensation. People who once admired his efficiency now questioned his ethics. Politicians, fearing voter backlash, turned against him. The tide had shifted. Rockefeller was silent. For years, he had refused interviews, photographs, even public appearances. But now, under relentless scrutiny, the cost of his empire began to show, not in dollars, but in peace of mind. The stress took a physical toll. He began to lose his hair in patches. At one point, his entire body was covered in alopecia. His once robust figure shrank. Doctors warned him of heart failure. And still, he kept going. Behind closed doors, a quiet transformation was beginning. He had always tithed to his church. But now, he turned his attention more fully to philanthropy. He began giving systematically, millions to education, medicine, and science. He funded the University of Chicago, helped eradicate hookworm in the American South, and created what would later become the Rockefeller Foundation, one of the most influential charitable organizations in the world. But philanthropy didn't stop the legal battles. In 1911, after years of lawsuits, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered its final verdict: Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly. The company was ordered to be broken up into 34 separate entities. It was the most dramatic corporate dismantling in American history. For many, it looked like defeat. A giant brought to his knees. A warning to every tycoon who thought himself above the law. But Rockefeller saw it differently. He had long since retired from active management. And ironically, the breakup made him richer than ever. Each of the new companies, Exxon, Chevron, Mobil, was wildly profitable. As their stock soared, so did his fortune. Yet wealth wasn't his focus anymore. In the final decades of his life, John D. Rockefeller became something he never expected: a public figure. He gave interviews, walked in public parks, handed out dimes to children with a soft smile. Some saw it as charm, others as guilt. But what mattered most was this: he was no longer the man in the shadows. He once said, "I believe that every right implies a responsibility, every opportunity, an obligation, every possession a duty. That was his new gospel. Not oil, but giving. Not domination, but legacy. And still, questions lingered. Was this transformation genuine, or a calculated rebranding? Did the man who built the most powerful monopoly in history ever truly regret how he built it? Or was it simply a different chapter in a long, complex life? The answers, perhaps, were buried with him. But one thing was certain, from here on, Rockefeller would no longer be known only as a tycoon. He would be remembered as something far more complicated, and perhaps, more human. After the 1911 Supreme Court ruling dismantled Standard Oil, many thought Rockefeller's power would vanish along with it. But instead, something remarkable happened. The breakup turned out to be a financial windfall. Each of the 34 new companies that emerged was strong, agile, and well-positioned in the growing energy market. As they prospered independently, their combined value exploded. And because Rockefeller still held massive shares in all of them, his personal wealth skyrocketed. By the time he was in his 70s, John D. Rockefeller became the richest man in the world, and arguably, the richest private individual in modern history. At the peak of his fortune, adjusted for inflation, it's estimated he was worth over $400 billion in today's dollars. But the man who had once hoarded control with iron precision now turned his energy toward giving it away. He believed deeply in structured, long-term philanthropy. Not charity as an emotional act, but as a science. In 1913, he founded the Rockefeller Foundation, with a vision to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. The results were staggering. His foundation funded groundbreaking medical research, helping to develop vaccines, modernize public health, and support global disease eradication efforts. He helped build major universities, including the University of Chicago and Rockefeller University. He supported the education of Black Americans through institutions like Spelman College, decades before civil rights reform. Rockefeller also helped fund the creation of the General Education Board, which revolutionized schooling across the southern U.S., particularly in impoverished rural communities. Through these initiatives, he didn't just give money, he shaped the infrastructure of modern philanthropy. His model of strategic giving would later influence figures like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, who cited Rockefeller as a model for how wealth could serve humanity. Still, the past never fully left him. Even as he handed out dimes to children and smiled for reporters in his later years, some never forgave him for the ruthless way he built his empire. Critics argued that no amount of giving could erase the damage done to small businesses and workers caught in the crosshairs of Standard Oil's dominance. But others saw a deeper arc. They saw a man who rose from poverty, built an empire through sheer discipline and ambition, and then chose, before he died, to try to give more than he took. Rockefeller himself remained humble in public statements. When asked about his wealth, he once replied, "God gave me the money." It wasn't arrogance. It was a deeply rooted belief that he had a responsibility to use his success for something bigger than himself. And in doing so, he transformed not only the oil industry, but how we think about power, responsibility, and legacy. Do you think it's possible to separate the man from his methods? Can greatness ever come without controversy? That's the paradox of John D. Rockefeller, a man both revered and reviled, whose triumphs cannot be told without also examining his trials. And yet, as his story neared its end, the quiet boy from Cleveland had achieved something almost unimaginable. He had become a symbol, not just of wealth, but of what one person, for better or worse, can do with a lifetime of relentless will. John D. Rockefeller lived to the age of 97, passing away in 1937. By the time of his death, the world had changed entirely. Industrial America had matured, the automobile age had begun, and oil had become the beating heart of the global economy. Much of that transformation could be traced back to Rockefeller's vision. He didn't invent oil. He didn't even discover the first well. But what he did was arguably more profound. He created a system. He took an unpredictable, dangerous resource and built a stable, reliable supply chain that powered homes, businesses, and eventually entire nations. He showed that through discipline, efficiency, and unshakable focus, it was possible to tame a chaotic industry, and in doing so, build something that lasted. But Rockefeller's legacy wasn't just industrial. It was deeply human. He remains a controversial figure, not because he was unclear, but because he was so intensely dual-natured. On one hand, the cold strategist who crushed competitors. On the other, the devoted Baptist who gave away vast sums to heal, educate, and uplift. And perhaps that's where the lesson lies. Because life is rarely black and white. People are not all good or all bad. Rockefeller's story reminds us that even those who rise with ferocity can learn to give with humility. That the hunger for power can evolve into a mission for impact. And that legacies are not written only in youth, but also in the choices we make when we already have the world at our feet. For learners of English and of life, there are powerful lessons in his journey. Work with focus. Plan with patience. Build with integrity where you can. And if success comes, let it be the beginning of something greater than yourself. It's easy to look at Rockefeller's wealth and see only the dollar signs. But beneath that fortune was a child who once feared poverty, a man who once craved stability, and finally, a soul who sought peace, not just for himself, but for the world he helped shape. If you were in his position, holding such power, facing such criticism, would you have changed course? Or would you have pushed forward, just as he did? His story invites us to reflect on what we build, and why. Whether we admire him, question him, or do both, we can't ignore the truth. John D. Rockefeller changed the world. And in doing so, he left behind a legacy that continues to challenge, inspire, and teach. Dear learners, we've now come to the end of our journey through the extraordinary life of John D. Rockefeller, a man born into hardship, shaped by discipline, driven by vision, and ultimately transformed by purpose. His story is not easy. It's filled with difficult choices, moral questions, and moments of raw ambition. But it's also filled with lessons about resilience, responsibility, and the power of reinvention. You may not build an oil empire. You may never see your name in history books. But the same qualities that lifted Rockefeller from obscurity, patience, focus, self-belief, and a willingness to adapt, are within reach for every one of us. Whether you are learning English to improve your future, pursuing a dream no one else sees, or simply trying to become a better version of yourself, remember, even the greatest journeys begin with uncertainty. And even the hardest roads can lead to light. So what about you? Did this story remind you of any personal experiences? If you were in Rockefeller's shoes, what kind of legacy would you want to leave behind? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If this story inspired you, if it helped you improve your English while opening your mind to something greater, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs courage. Someone who's on their own journey. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the bell so you never miss another true story that changes how we learn and live. Until next time, keep learning, keep dreaming, and keep believing in your power to shape the world. Goodbye for now.